Hello watch enthusiasts! Now the past month has seen a great many interesting releases at SIHH 2018. However, apart from these, various brands have released their own updates and new creations which in my eyes are worthy of discussion, but simply have been ignored a bit. And so as a result, I'd like to speak about various new releases which offer something different, and indeed some from Breitling, for example, which are questionable, whilst Hamilton have released a piece which I think is one of the best corporate decisions that Hamilton have made in recent years. However, before I begin, I would of course like to encourage you all to join the Watch Guys, which is my group on Snups, which is a social media platform really where you can share pictures of your collections and interests, and where you can share in the passion for watches on the Watch Guys, which is a group which is set up under this channel. And do feel free to leave any questions or indeed any interesting pictures you happen to have of your collections in order to share with the community. And indeed, I'm happy to answer any questions to the best of my ability and knowledge, and indeed to really strive to be able to answer as many as possible. And so do follow the link down below to join that. And the featured picture today is this fantastic picture of a Rolex Daytona 16520, which is of course the pre-in-house model with a zenith movement which can be quickly told from its clean design and also from its aligned subdials, as opposed to the slightly offline versions of the later models. Now the first watch I'd like to talk about is an exceptionally good value timepiece, and this is the new Hamilton Khaki Field Mechanical 38mm. And the inspiration of this watch is immediately apparent. This watch is designed after the design of the watches from the mid-20th century manufactured by Hamilton for the armed forces and indeed for soldiers to be worn during conflict. And these watches were often seen on the wrists of soldiers during conflicts such as the Vietnam War, and so as a result became rather legendary as far as legible field watches went. The design of these watches was characterised by the bead-blasted cases, the drilled lugs, as well as the large crowns in order to wind these originally manually wound timepieces. The dials were also matte black, as is the case on this reproduction, with this style of numerals in both the 12-hour clock and the military time, in order to create a greater ease of use. Then one did also have luminescent hands and a dial, in order to make it clear to read and quick to read as well, without the use of a date as well. And Hamilton have made various reproductions of these watches in the past, though never with this sort of accuracy. And before this point we saw the standard manual field Khaki, which featured a more modern style of dial and the date. But I think with this watch they really have hit the nail on the head and produced something which I think will appeal to a lot of buyers and a lot of collectors alike. Because this does take clear inspiration from those hacking Hamiltons, which had a second hand which would stop, which has become very commonplace today, but of course a lot of watches didn't have this, for the simple reason that back then we didn't expect it. But indeed, now one has come to expect this from Swiss movements. But back then they included this in order to allow watches to be synchronised, because these were so extensively used by the armed forces. And they've really managed to make a watch which is beautifully finished here, with a bead-blasted case and drilled lugs, which means that you can change the strap very, very quickly and easily. It is also 38mm in diameter, which makes it on the small side, but because of its long lug-to-lug distance, it shouldn't be a problem to wear on really very large wrists as well, which is something I appreciate with this design, because it means it's infinitely versatile. Then the lugs are also very long, which allows many straps to fit between the case and indeed the spring bars, which is often a complaint with more high-end luxury timepieces. And inside the stainless steel case of this watch, the dial is also the same matte black with simply Hamilton on the dial, without the large Khaki text admittedly seen on some of the older models, but still with a very, very clean layout with those 12 hours finished in a much softer font to the usual style, which is in keeping with the originals. And it is unmistakably extremely legible, with the military time running around the inside of the dial, and these cream luminescent hands, which I think work very well, and of course a luminescent colour is something very personal in terms of what you like, but I think they've really done a very good job here. Then the crown is nice and large, which is something I appreciate, because this watch houses an ETA 2801-2, which is a 42-hour manually wound hacking movement from ETA. And the beauty of this movement is that it means that the watch can be very slim, because it doesn't have to have the automatic winding rotor, or indeed the assembly which would connect that to the spring, which makes this watch potentially a more connected and more classical watch to own as well as the way it looks, which is something often neglected, and I think a lot of people appreciate manually wound watches, because they do offer something which we don't necessarily need, which is of course the automatic aspect, because winding a watch isn't really the greatest hardship you can imagine. I think the choice of strap was a very nice one as well, in this khaki green, which is a NATO strap, which is again in keeping with the way these watches were worn to stay on the wrist no matter what. But it features these nice brown leather inserts, which mean that it's a more versatile strap, and it doesn't have the harsh military aspect that one with the normal steel keepers would have, and has a signed brushed buckle from Hamilton. And as the cherry on the top for this watch, it comes in at around £370, or €420 and $475, which makes it a very interesting alternative in terms of price to other military watches on the market. And I think for a lot of people, the style of a casual field watch like this, with an interesting design, was something confined to higher price ranges. But here this means that you have a watch which means that you can get something softer than, say, a Marathon, which is designed purely for its functionality and does so extremely well, but something different on the market which offers something to the more casual user, with a style which is unmistakably Hamilton inspired of the past, but is beautifully manufactured and is produced by a brand who is truly reputable in this field. And so for this price, I think this is a very interesting piece. And indeed, the reason why I wanted to talk about this today is because they're currently on pre-order to be delivered in around February. So I'd recommend you take a look on the Hamilton website if you are interested. This past month we've also seen two new releases from Oris, both in their divers segment but in two very different sections. And the first I'd like to speak about is the new 39.5mm version of the Oris Aquis. And last year we saw the Aquis range overhauled with a new 43mm variant, with a new style of case which was streamlined a bit, with new, less jagged crown guards, and a softer design generally, with redesigned hands. And I made no particular secret of the fact that I personally didn't like the design. And I stand by that. I find that it has lost a bit of its individuality. But nonetheless, the quality of these watches is beyond question, and they are, for those who appreciate the styling of these watches, wonderful pieces to own. But they didn't replace the 40mm version until now. And now we have a 39.5mm version, which is a hair smaller than previously, but still remains very much a piece to be worn by most people. And what I do appreciate with this watch are the proportions. Previously, the 40mm version appeared very out of balance in my eyes, because the strap appeared far too narrow for the case shape, whereas now we've seen these two brought together a bit, and a design that's become a little bit more carefully considered, which I appreciate. And this new version comes in three variants, with the choice of either a stainless steel bracelet, a rubber strap, or indeed a leather strap. And the watch comes with either a matte black dial with a brushed ceramic bezel insert, which again has been cleaned up with a more sharp and more crisp and contemporary design. Meanwhile, there are two versions with sunburst dials and polished bezels, which are the blue and the black, and those are polished ceramic bezels, which are far more conventional, but in many ways are more lustrous, though I personally do like those brushed bezels that they've implemented. And these watches do appear very, very well considered in terms of working as a package, and I feel this is crucial with a watch like this, which takes an integrated bracelet, which is built specifically for the watch, and you can't fit a strap to, other than one of the proprietary Oris ones. Because the quality of the Oris bracelets is really excellent, and they're now tapered more than ever, which means that they're more wearable with a dress cuff, for example. And of course one shouldn't wear a dive watch traditionally with a suit, for example, but it's such common practice these days, I think it's worthwhile having a watch which can undertake that, and is slim enough at 12.5mm to fit nicely. The rubber straps and leather straps are also of beautiful quality, and work very, very nicely with these timepieces. Then we have the symmetry to these watches with the date at 6 o'clock, and with a very nicely regulated Sleater SW200-1, which is an easily serviced movement, which is just what you want in a timepiece like this, with still beautiful detailing, with polishing on the bracelet along with the very fine brushing, and then those sunburst effect dials with applied and faceted indices, which provide excellent luminescence at night, which is just what you want. In truth, my only qualm with this watch is the price. And the issue is, I feel that Oris are overreaching themselves, in my eyes at least, with regards to pricing. And Oris certainly does have a history founded in 1904, but nonetheless I find the fact that these watches start at $1,800 and finish at $2,000, with the straps being $1,800 and the bracelet for the $2,000 price tag, I feel they simply can't justify their value. And I say this not because I don't think they're high quality, because having owned an Oris Aquis, I can certainly say they are. But I find the fact that these watches will depreciate to, say, £700 or £800 within a few years does lead me to believe that it's difficult to justify this price. And that's for people in England, £1,250 to £1,450, which is very rapidly encroaching on something like a Zin U1, which is, with the best will in the world, a superior watch in terms of features and functionality. And I think the real competitor to these watches is the Christopher Ward's C60 Trident, which is a watch which costs over £500 less on the bracelet, if you go for a strap version of that watch, which is I think, a price difference which is difficult to ignore, bearing in mind they offer very similar features, with the Christopher Ward's depth rating being twice that of the Oris, though admittedly the Oris does offer an exhibition caseback and the history. So it certainly is a toss-up, but with regards to that, I do think it's difficult to justify the price of this watch, though of course the quality will be fantastic. The second interesting watch I found released from Oris this month is a new version of the Oris Cull Brashear, this time a chronograph. And this has the Diver 65 style of case in a 43mm size, except this time, like the original Cull Brashear, which commemorates the first African-American diver in the US Navy, as well as the first amputee diver due to a terrible accident. Now we have a watch which is cased in bronze, and it's a bronze which provides that wonderful colour when it's new, but of course discolours quite quickly to provide a patina which is very appealing and looks far more vintage than any steel case could ever look. And despite having that bronze case, it does have a stainless steel caseback with Cull Brashear's helmet engraved into it. And the idea of that is to avoid staining on your skin or indeed an allergic reaction which could occur due to the reactivity of the metal. And it does feature now a cut and an engraved style of bezel insert rather than a painted one. And it still has the unidirectional bezel and those very clear and legible indices. However, now it features a chronograph function inside this 100-metre water-resistant case. And the chronograph is derived from a Sleater SW510, which is their version of the Veligere 7750, but now modified to be horizontally mounted rather than having that vertical orientation. And it also features this beautiful gradient style of blue dial, with the blue reaching its climax at the centre of the dial and fading into obscurity like the sea, which is a beautiful, beautiful look underneath this heavily domed sapphire crystal to provide that distortion that one appreciates. The case finishing is very nicely done, with brushing on the top of the lugs and some polished areas around the crown and pushers. But then one also has the hands, which are matching in colour, along with the applied indices and even the colour of the second track around the edge of the dial. And this is the first diving chronograph in this line seen from Oris, and I think they've done an extremely good job of amalgamating the functions with a dive watch to create something very different and very attractive in design. They've also removed the date, which I think was a good choice to keep this watch clean, which would have been a possibility to have the date on this movement, but I'm glad they didn't include it, because it means that you have a very nicely balanced dial, which doesn't cut into the indices too much, and retains a certain legibility that otherwise wouldn't be present. And the watch itself comes in at $4,950 or £3,600, which is certainly a very high price, and again shows this area of Oris, which I do find is simply too much for what the watch offers. However, I can see where they're coming from in terms of this watch being a limited edition of 2,000 pieces, and I don't think this watch will sell badly at all. And I must say I'm more forgiving of this watch's price because it is a limited run watch, and is a very different timepiece from the brand, which I think many will be keen to get hold of. And the design of the watch does remain very true to the style of dive helmets seen back then, and equipment in this particular tone of colour, with a strap which appears like the straps used by divers for various pieces of equipment back then, along with a matching bronze buckle, which will again receive the same patina as the rest of the case over time, and provide you with a very attractive and unique watch to your own style of usage, as it will react simply to the way that you use this timepiece, as opposed to steel, which simply appears scratched and damaged. One new and interesting release from Omega is the new version of the Seamaster to commemorate the Olympic Games. And this version features a 39.5mm case in stainless steel. And these watches are designed to commemorate Omega's involvement with the Olympic Games, and not simply the Winter Olympics coming up. Because personally I find those watches produced for those a tad boring, whereas these are very interesting, and take direct inspiration from several stopwatches made in the 1970s. And they feature these beautiful little onion crowns, which do admittedly reduce their water resistance from the normal 150 metres you would expect as the baseline for Seamasters down to about 60. However, the 39.5mm cases appear very attractive in a fully brushed finish, with these additional polished elements added to these twisted lugs. The dials, however, are the focal point, and they all feature this style of domed black and white dial, which looks somewhat like the bullseye dials seen on some of their 70s models. Then we have a secondary accent colour, being blue, yellow, simply white, or green and red, being the 5 colours of the Olympics. These are matched with perforated leather straps, which again match the colour very nicely. This colour is also seen on the second hand and on the Seamaster logo, with the date placed at 6 o'clock, which matches very nicely with that inner dial. And they also feature, rather uniquely, this ring around the edge of the dial, which has the Olympic rings at the bottom of the dial at 6 o'clock. And this comes in the same colour as the rest of the watch, and allows you to use it as a pulsometer, as it lasts 20 seconds. There are also nods to other Omega references. For example, the dials, rather inconspicuously in fact, feature these details, such as the fact that the second track, or minute track depending on how you look at it, is staggered in the same way as a racing dial is, which is an inspired and very interesting feature and different aspect to this watch, which otherwise would perhaps go unnoticed if not looked at carefully. Which is something I appreciate about these watches, the fact that you do have to stop and look at them to really appreciate the design in its simplicity and its elegance. Then it simply has straight hands, but they feature this squared-off finish, which is reminiscent of a Xing 1, for example, but in a more delicate execution, which gives a layout which does appear sporty, but also as a watch which could very happily be worn casually or indeed as a dress watch, due to the leather strap and the slim profile. Internally, the watch is the same standard of movement as you see in all of the higher-end coaxial Omegas, so these are fully in-house movements, albeit made by ETA, which feature an 8800 caliber layout, so it's a 7 tick a second or 25,200 vibration per hour movement with 35 joules and a coaxial master chronometer certification, which means that it's both extremely accurate and anti-magnetic to 15,000 Gauss, with a fantastic view through the exhibition caseback of the movement itself, with a ring of the various dates of the various Olympics moving on into the future and into the past. What I find most appealing about the design of these watches, and the reason why I think they're going to sell extremely well for their list price of $5,400, ignoring the fact they are limited editions of 2032, is that they offer a wonderful hybrid between an Aquaterra and the style with the short lugs of the Veneziana model, designed to be a throwback to the 50s Seamasters. And this provides this all in a package which also has the 70s in its hands and dial layout, which means it's a wonderful glimpse through Omega's history at a really beautiful design. The final release I'd like to talk about is a very major one, because this is the first release with Georges Kern as the head of Breitling, having moved away from Richemont prior to this. And this is an interesting move for Breitling, because they're moving into a brand new territory with a new line of Navitimers. However, in truth, this line, called the Navitimer 8, is nothing like anything we've ever seen from the Navitimer range before, and at least in my eyes, not in a good way. Now, I will elaborate on that, because I think that's a bold statement to say about these watches, which, in truth, I imagine will be extremely well made, but it's from an ideological perspective that I don't like these. And their designs take inspiration from the 8 aviation department, which was set up by Breitling in the 1930s, which made pilots' chronographs and chronographs built into the dashboards of aircraft of that era. And so these are meant to draw inspiration from that era of aviation, which is another area where these watches, in my eyes, don't quite cut the mustard. Now, the least expensive, or at least what we can assume is going to be the least expensive model in the range, as we haven't yet received pricing for most of these watches, is the automatic. And this is a 41 by 10.74mm stainless steel or DLC coated watch, which sits somewhere between a dress watch and a sports watch. It has a rotating bezel with a single marker at 12 o'clock to keep time, and then there's a simple 3-hand layout with the date at 6 o'clock. The dial comes in various variations from blacks to blues, but you generally have this style of a dress form of dial with these hands which are typical of aviation, with a pointed second hand. The dials are also sunburst effect, which gives a certain lustre to these watches which otherwise wouldn't be there. And we see brushed and polished finishes across the cases, which are very classical Breitling, but more 60s Breitling than 1930s. And this watch will be powered by an ETA 2824-2, which again is comparable to something like an IWC Pilot range of watch, which approaches this area in a similar way. However, I feel this model is the greatest insult to the name, because this watch is called a Navitimer. Now, I don't mean to be dismissive of this watch before it's even properly released, but I do find the fact that this watch is labelled a Navitimer, a watch known for its slide rule bezel and its chronograph functions, and the fact that this watch has neither of those aspects, and yet it's still labelled by that name, I find misleading and, frankly, a tad too commercialised, really, the way that Breitling is trying to approach this concept of advertising, by branding something that clearly is not a Navitimer, which I think is a shame because ever since the 1950s, when the Navitimer was first introduced as a successor to the Chronomat, this watch was a completely separate model from their external bezel Chronograph pilot's watches, so I find this crossover jarring and a bit problematic, really. The next rung up in the range from the simple automatic model is the day and date model, and this features the same 41mm diameter case, with indeed the option of a leather strap or a metal bracelet, but it is slightly thicker at 11.19mm. It now also features the date at 6 o'clock, but also the day at 12 o'clock on white wheels in both cases, which again is a missed opportunity in my eyes, because I feel that whereas they've taken the care on the automatic model to make these the same colour as the dial, no such care has been taken with the day and date version, which again is a shame, I feel, and makes this design appear incongruous and not as functional as it perhaps could be, whilst as a pilot's watch it loses the luminescence at the top of the dial in favour of having this additional function. Now likewise, this model is available with blue and black sunburst dials, whilst that bezel remains the same with a brushed effect on it, as well as that small triangle at 12 o'clock, which isn't luminescent in the case of this timepiece. It is water resistant to 100 metres as well, which means it's a varied sports watch of no particular direction, other than being a fairly simple pilot's model with those 3 hands day and date. In the middle of the range we have the chronograph version, and I've been asked by a great many people what I think of this watch and indeed the rest of the range, and I must admit with this timepiece I like it a great deal. I think the design is extremely tasteful and very carefully performed and executed, with a very appealing style of sunburst blue dial and that typical Veligere 7750 arrangement of subdials with the day-date complication. You really are getting a lot of functionality, as well as having that bezel. Additionally, this watch is available with the blacks and blues as far as dials go, and with separate non-sunburst subdials to create contrast. This is added to the bracelet, which, knowing Breitling, will be extremely well manufactured, and the quality of this watch will no doubt be excellent. However, I do still resent the fact that this is called a Navitimer, because it simply doesn't show any of the characteristics that would typically have, and doesn't really tie in with the history either, which seems to be the general consensus of those who've emailed me about this timepiece. The sizing of this watch, however, is very much in keeping with the aviation style, moving up to 43mm by 14.17mm, and retaining that 100-metre water resistance, making this a very versatile sports watch in a complete sense, which I think is something that will be very appealing to a lot of buyers who are looking for one of these chronographs. And of course there are 2 chronographs in the range, but there is one in between, if you will, as far as models go, which is of course the Unitime. Now, the Unitime is a watch which I want to dislike because of my prejudice against this model range as a result of their poor choice of name. However, overall, I think this is a very, very interesting watch, and one which I think will hopefully sell very well, because I think it really is a worthy investment as far as pieces go. Because this moves into the in-house version of this range, and that's really shown by the fact that the bezels go from brushed to polished. And this contains a calibre which is the B35, which was one of Breitling's early in-house movements, and provides something which is rather different, in fact, to this watch, because it allows you to have a second time zone. And the hour hand actually operates independently of the other 2 hands in order for you to be able to set it and use this as a world time timepiece, but with a much simpler style of dial with the date at 6 o'clock. And as you can see, you can control that internal bezel in order to realign the various time zones and be able to then calculate and figure out exactly what the time is everywhere in the world, which I think is a brilliant idea, and one which is very versatile and useful, especially for those who travel a great deal, or indeed those who have to do business with people in other parts of the world, and you need to know exactly what time it is in those locations. And it's the details of this model that I find most interesting. For example, the size remains 43mm despite the fact this watch is designed to be a semi-dress watch, because otherwise the dial would simply appear too small in the middle of that ring of cities, which is quite a curious choice, and I think does demonstrate the way in which Breitling have worked around the problem of dial real estate in order to create something truly interesting. And there are details like, for example, the polished centre link of the bracelet, which simply add lustre to this watch, and reinforce the credibility of this watch as a genuine luxury dress watch. The dial colours do change a tad with this timepiece, as it's now available in black in a sunburst effect, or indeed in silver with that sunburst effect, which appear to be the sort of day and night or options and alternatives. My personal favourite is the silver, just because I feel it does give such a bright and different look to this watch, though the black is still extremely attractive as well. Now, the first model which we actually have price for in this collection, and indeed is the only model we have the price for in this collection, is the new Navitimer 8 B01. And this is a great looking piece. I think there's no argument there. It's a phenomenal looking in-house chronograph from Breitling, which comes exclusively with a black dial, a polished bezel, and that Tricompax reverse panda layout. And it's a 43mm by 14.5mm watch, with of course the B01 in-house caliber, and the date at 4:30. And the design of the watch is truly classic, with that external bezel, as well as that Tricompax chronograph layout, and the simple Breitling setup. And whilst I do disagree with this watch being labelled a Navitimer, as I've said quite a lot, I think that's not detracting from the fact that it is a beautiful looking timepiece and is extremely well executed, with brushed tops to the lugs and polished bevels. But in my eyes, though, this looks much more like something like a Breitling 765 Copilot, which I'd encourage you to Google in order to see what I mean, because this watch really is a child of that style of pilot's watch, as opposed to the Navitimer. And whilst both movements are cost chronometers and chronographs, I feel this movement does have more merit than the Velgio 7750 in terms of the price of this watch at 7,100 Swiss francs, because this movement offers a 70-hour power reserve and is a 46-jewel in-house movement with an automatic chronograph setup and a layout which is far more aesthetically pleasing, being far more symmetrical, which I think a lot of watch lovers do appreciate. Though I must admit, bearing in mind the price of this watch, I do think that, for example, a Hoya or Tavia, the new models, are better value. I can certainly understand someone wanting to go for one of these, simply due to the aesthetic beauty of one of these timepieces, as far as great-looking Breitlings go. And so I'm rather curious what you think of the watches I've included, especially the value of the Hamilton, the price of the Orises, and indeed the controversy with regards to the naming of the Breitlings, and whether you think it's a good idea to name something in order to follow on with the range, or indeed whether things should be named for accuracy. Because I really am very curious, because I do see that my particular perspective of these watches is rather biased, simply because I'm particularly interested in the history of these pieces, and so as a result it doesn't really appeal to me. But I really am interested to hear what you think, because it certainly does matter to me. So do leave your comments down below in the comments, and indeed on the Snups group as well for further discussion. So thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy the video, then please do like, share and subscribe to help the channel and to be able to enjoy more content here in future. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.